PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. PA Books features interviews with authors about books on Pennsylvania history, culture, and politics. In this episode, we talk with Thomas Baldino and Paula Duda Holoviak about their book, Pennsylvania Government and Politics.
This week on PA Books, Paula Duda Holoviak and Thomas Baldino, authors of Pennsylvania Government and Politics.
We are joined by Paula Duda Holoviak, professor and graduate coordinator of the Master of Public Administration program at Kutztown University, and Thomas Baldino, emeritus professor of political science at Wilkes University. They are the authors of Pennsylvania Government and Politics, Understanding Public Policy in the Keystone State. Paula, we talk about Pennsylvania being a commonwealth. What does that mean?
Well, when we were chatting a little bit, we do know that power to the people is probably the best way to describe a commonwealth. And it was William Penn's vision that the local individuals would be empowered. And that's why we have so many local governments in Pennsylvania, because we believe in self-local government.
Now, you'd say in the book that the theme is institutionalism. What is institutionalism?
Institutionalism refers to the concept that institutions like a government or parts of the government matter in how policy is made and implemented. Right? There was a time, this is very political science-y, but there was a time when political scientists focused on the law, that is to say, looking at constitutions and statutes passed by the legislature, and less at the institutions themselves. And there was a time when it was, let's look at how people and actors within the system, individuals like governors or legislators, they were instrumental in passing or affecting public policy. The institutionalism came into vogue back in the 60s, and there was way too technical, but a new institutionalism. And what we try to emphasize here is that in the book, that institutions are important in understanding public policy and the development of public policy. And so while we have a chapter on each of the major institutions, the legislature, the governor, and the courts, we do examine other parts of the system: parties, elections, interest groups, the bureaucracy, and those we look at through the lens of institutionalism when appropriate, and when not, we find other ways of including them in the discussion of the development of public policy.
And you talk about how institutions have norms and rules and structures, yes, and that those actually shape people's behavior when they're operating within those systems.
Right, because you have to, for example, within the legislature, you have to follow certain rules about how a bill is considered and when it's debated and when it's introduced. So we get the sort of policy that we get because of the structure of Pennsylvania government. I think a really good example, there's been a talk about moving to an open primary system. So right now, so our viewers know or read the book, that in Pennsylvania you have to pick a party, and you can only vote in that party during the primary. There's been some discussion about the different models. Well, we could eliminate the party system, or you could pick your party when you show up, or so it would allow independents to participate in the primary. But that's going to be really hard to get through the Pennsylvania legislature. So it's because, again, of the structure and the way in which the party structure and the two-party system within the state legislature, I think those kind of structural changes are really hard to bring forward.
So if I may, so there are the formal rules, the Constitution, the laws of the legislature, and then there are the informal norms and traditions that are the kind of unwritten guardrails to the political system. And one of the things that I think I took away from doing this is the importance of the informal norms and rules. During the pandemic and that 2020 presidential election, there were many instances where both parties and parts of each branch of government I won't say violated norms and traditions, but certainly did things that raised questions about whether or not their behavior was within the norms and traditions that help guide public policy. And so if I'm retired, but if I were ever to be back in the classroom, I would be placing as much emphasis on the norms and traditions as the Constitution and the laws in teaching, whether it's state government, Pennsylvania government, or American government, which was once my bread and butter course at Wilkes.
Since norms tend to be informal,
yes.
How do political scientists study and measure them?
Well, a lot of interviewing, all right, and just observing behavior, because the norms manifest themselves by how people talk and act. Okay, so famous political scientist Richard Fenno did a lot of work on Congress, and he talked about his method as poking and soaking. He would go around the members of Congress and poke his nose in and talk and soak up the atmosphere, and where he came to understand what the norms are. So in the old days, I'm moving away from Pennsylvania government, but it was the same here in Pennsylvania. The tradition was, if you were a new member of the legislature, you kept your nose out of everyone's business. You observed and followed, because that was the tradition. You learned by observing and listening, and a senior member would take the new member under his or her wing and provide instruction. That's out the window. It's out the window at the congressional level.
Right,
but
also
also
true in
at the
Pennsylvania, where if you were the new kid on the block, you got the low-level, unimportant assignments and committee, and there was the strong tradition of seniority. But that's really out the window. Even it predates COVID, where you started to have a decline in the norms of the institution, mainly because a lot of people were running for themselves, not necessarily as part of a party machine. So raising their own money. Social media has totally changed the way in which you run. So everything becomes personal now. So you're your own star. And we see that even in the Pennsylvania legislature. People have their image, and they stick to that image, and even if it means defying the leadership. So that's a norm that is slowly shifting.
So as these norms are shifting, one of the key things to look at is how institutions serve us to maintain democracy. And so as the norms shift, how does that affect our ability to maintain democracy? Well,
it really makes it really hard to govern. We were seeing it, of course, at the national level in Congress, but we see it here in Pennsylvania, where this is getting a little bit better, I think, in this session, but it's very difficult to get anything through because of the close, especially in the House of Representatives right now in Pennsylvania. It's just very difficult to legislate at all. So that would be an example of democracy not working because you can't pass anything.
So another example of violating the norms, it was in the past highly unusual for an incumbent member of a party running in the legislature to face a challenge in a primary. The party would work to keep that from happening. We're watching right now, where we live in Luzerne County, the 117th district. The incumbent, a man named Cabell, is losing by 3 votes to a challenger, and Mr. Cabell is conservative. His challenger is even more conservative. Right? So when you have these kinds of things going on, it demonstrates the weakness of the parties. That in this case, the Republican Party was unable to keep Cabell from experiencing this kind of challenge and expending a fair amount of financial resources to win in a primary where there's no Democrat running against the incumbent. And when you take those kinds of situations into account, and you're the leaders in the House or the Senate, and regardless of party, your leadership is constantly being questioned by people who have not necessarily a strong allegiance to the party, they're running as their own people, right? So cutting a deal with however many members of your party. In this case, the Democrats have a 1-seat majority in the House. So you've got 101 members. You've got to cut 101 deals, in a sense. And that's not easy to do. In the old days, it was a lot easier. There was something called walking around money. That's WAMs. There's a form of WAMs still around. They don't call it WAMs anymore. But, and you would use that money to encourage people to vote for a bill that the leadership wanted or that the governor wanted. Can't use that anymore, okay? The walking around money, or whatever they're calling it these days, is used to say, vote for this bill and we'll make sure that your volunteer fire company gets some extra money. Or you want a playground in your district, we'll see that the money is there for that. Or any number of other local projects that wouldn't necessarily be included in a larger appropriations bill to fund roads or highways.
So do you find that in the absence of those type of financial incentives, which tend to be non-ideological, right?
Right.
Does that tend then to lead people to compete more on ideological issues?
Apparently, I remember, I don't remember who told me this, but I was talking to a retired state legislator who said things really changed when the Tea Party arose and people began to run with the Tea Party ideology. So that predates where we are now, but that's when things began to break down as far as party discipline in the House and Senate. Yes, this race that we're talking about in the 117th was extraordinarily ideological. I thought, because I live there, and I thought that our current representative was very conservative, and somebody to the right of him has come out and appears to be, I guess, they certified the election yesterday, appears to have taken that seat.
They didn't certify that race. They certified
certify,
all the other
okay.
races in the county.
All right. So, yes, it's extraordinarily ideological. And I believe the ideological issue had to do with what's being taught in schools, in the public schools. There was some of that going on in regard to critical race theory. A lot of things that aren't necessarily the purview of the state legislature, but that was brought up in the race.
So I'm going to go back to the beginning. Right? We can't talk about Pennsylvania politics without talking about William Penn. Yes. So there are the frames of government. Talk a little bit about what his ideas were and how did he set Pennsylvania's government up?
Okay, so the frame is another word for constitution. And back in the day, while he wanted the people involved, he also wanted to be in control. So rather than call himself a governor, he called himself the proprietor. Okay? And either Penn himself or his designee or later members of his family were the proprietor. And over the earliest days, when Penn was tied up with business in England, either in jail or whatever, he fell in and out of favor with the king. So he was occasionally literally behind bars. He would designate someone to be here. The divisions that arose early on were not exactly political parties as we know them today, but there were those within the community who saw the proprietor as overly powerful, and there were those who wanted more power to the people. And those groups formed there were proto-parties. They were parties in the making. And until 1776, when the revolution occurred, those parties, those proto-parties, helped to divide the legislature. And so besides the proprietor or governor, there was the legislature, the assembly. And the assembly, in terms of its earliest years, unicameral, but then eventually bicameral, and there's a lot of history there, right? And we could spend the whole rest of the time on that. But those early days, Penn's vision was to allow the people a voice in the system, hence the legislature, and there were councils of advisors that the proprietor allowed, and they worked their way into the first constitution that Pennsylvania had after 1776. And that was considered at the time the most radical of the 13 constitutions in the state, because the governor's office was essentially a titular head of government. had very, very little power. The legislature had the real authority. And there was a very early and rudimentary court system. Okay. The second constitution, which came along not that long after, because the first constitution wasn't working very well, because it was so radical, took on the appearance much more like the United States federal system, where there was a governor with real authority and a bicameral legislature and a fully formed court system.
But I also think, if you don't mind, that we have to think about Penn's vision, which was revolutionary at the time in regard to equality, religious freedom, rights that were written into Pennsylvania's first constitution that are still there, that were actually the model for the United States Bill of Rights. We take all this for granted. Pennsylvania really was about, and that gets into the political culture of Pennsylvania, which I'm sure you're going to ask about. You know, we really are independent thinking and freedom seeking. And there was also a period too where I know there was a dispute between, in Penn's time, with the actual municipalities, including the city of Philadelphia, versus the power of his government. So we have a long history of independence and rights and freedoms that are guaranteed to the constituents.
Now, during Penn's time, there were 4 frames of government. So clearly there was some give and take, and he was adapting to other power centers within the colony at that time.
Yeah.
How significant were those 4 frames? Do we still see elements of them in Pennsylvania political culture today?
Well, just so you know, one of those frames was written while he was out of the country with his problems. And when he came back, they rewrote it and under his direction. I would say that what we see in present constitutions, especially the current one, and actually all of them, there's been 5 since the 1776, the Bill of Rights aspect. Yeah, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, and the emphasis on free practice of religion. Because as a Quaker, one of the reasons he founded Pennsylvania was to create a place where people like him, whose religion was not necessarily widely accepted, or to say it wasn't terribly well accepted in England, he wanted that opportunity for his people of his faith to practice their religions here. Now, to his credit, when he was literally recruiting people to come to Pennsylvania, he didn't just recruit Quakers, but he recruited people from various religious sects in Europe. And so they came from Germany, and so you had people from the Anabaptist movement coming here, and those people settled in the various hills and valleys across eastern Pennsylvania. Basically, the state under the commonwealth, I mean, the land that was titled is the state of Pennsylvania, but those earliest settlements were mostly Harrisburg and east, or Philadelphia and west, right, to Harrisburg. And the various communities were by ethnicity and religion, and as Paul mentioned, in the political culture and the struggles in those early days, with Philadelphia being such a large community, and at one time it was the largest city in the state, its political influence was feared by the rest of the state.
That hasn't changed. These are things that we still see.
Yes.
Right. The power, the political power and might of Philadelphia is something that's come from colonial times till today.
Yep.
You know, it's a huge, it dominates state politics.
Well, at least that's the perception.
And so, right, that's another thing that's come through the ages, that urban-rural struggle, the ability to, you know, not to have the urban areas dominate the rural areas. That goes back to Penn's time, and it continues to this very day, to the current government.
So I want to go back to the 1776 Constitution. You say it was radical, and the people who implemented it were known as radicals,
yes,
correct?
They were,
so,
yes.
And one of the achievements underneath that Constitution was the Gradual Abolition Act. So
yes.
What was it that made them radicals, and what was it that made that Constitution radical?
Well, you can say it was their Quakers, the Quaker influence in the state, and their emphasis on having lived under the proprietor, the anti-proprietor group, and they had a different name, but they won. And so they stripped the governor's powers to the barest of minimum, and this legislature, the General Assembly, was incredibly powerful, and that made it radical. And radical also in the sense that there was the freedom of religion and the ability of people of color, right?
To live freely.
To live freely, right?
Now, there would be another constitutional convention or another constitution implemented in 1790. Now, this is after the federal constitution is implemented.
Yes.
So was this influenced by the U.S. Constitution?
Well, I would say given the difficulties in governing under that first constitution and a shift in power, so more moderate types got in control, called for a new constitution. They wrote it, and it does look much more like the U.S. Constitution that was ratified in 1787.
So I want to touch again on a couple other constitutions before we can start talking about the actual structure of the government. But in 1838, there was another constitution, and one of the key things here was voting rights was one of the key elements. Can you talk about that and why that was significant?
You want?
Go ahead.
Okay.
I'm sorry, he wrote that portion of it.
Yes, so there were, so let me just say this. Every time the Constitution in Pennsylvania was changed, it was in response to some significant problem. So in 1838, there were issues with voting rights and getting more people involved. And so in a sad way, the voting rights of African Americans was restricted. Okay, it doesn't come back again until the Constitution of 1873.
Yes, they had to address the fact that they had restricted the voting rights of free.
Yeah, it was a step backward.
blacks.
When the United States was eventually moving towards expanding voting rights, we were coming in and restricting it.
Restricted at that time.
Yeah, and there were some other things with the legislature that were fixed or adjusted in that Constitution of. The second Constitution. So, yeah, I mean, again, looking at these various constitutions, the effort was to refine the Constitution so that the government functioned more efficiently. Essentially, besides the voting, the changes that come later, as the state literally grew in size and population and as industry changed, right? I mean, at that point, Pennsylvania was still predominantly an agricultural state, but there was a growing industrial base. The railroads were expanding. Coal production was ramping up in a big way. And the legislature wasn't keeping pace, and so there were refinements to the legislature that was intended to help the legislature, which was meeting on a part-time basis at that point, to help it meet a bit more, help it to legislate more effectively by adding more opportunities to meet. Okay.
So let's just talk about the structure of Pennsylvania government as we see it today. And then we can always dip back in and look at where some of those elements came from. Many of us are familiar with the three branches of government. Can you just kind of give us an overview of what our government looks like?
Right.
Well, it's very similar to the national government in that you have a strong executive. Our governor has a great deal of power, and in some ways even a bit more power than the President of the United States, particularly when it comes to the budget. Our governor is primarily the source. You know, his budget comes in to the legislature as opposed to in Congress, where the budget comes in and they say, thanks, we're going to do our own thing. It's the framework for what the legislature will debate going forward. So the governor has a great deal of power. The legislature, which is fairly large, especially, well, it's fairly large. There's been a lot of discussion about the size of the legislature, but that really enables greater representation across the Commonwealth. So you do know your state representative. You literally know them, and they're your neighbor. They're not in some faraway place. And so the legislature, of course, is full-time in Pennsylvania. You can make a living. They are in session most of the year. And then we have a reformed court system. As we reformed in our most recent Constitution, one of the biggest things we reformed was the unified court system, so that you have equal justice across the Commonwealth. You don't get a different ruling in Lehigh County than you do in Luzerne County, because all of that is centralized. And then there is a balance of powers, where the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court acts like the Supreme Court of the United States and rules on the actions of both the governor and the legislature, and determines their constitutionality according according to the Pennsylvania Constitution. Matters of national constitutional issues would have to go to the United States Supreme Court.
Now, you also talk in your book about political culture and the theories of political culture that political scientists are experimenting with and looking at. When we look at Pennsylvania, it is a richly diverse geographically and demographically. What are some of the different political cultures that political scientists have seen in Pennsylvania?
Well, I did want to point out, as you mentioned, that we because of the influence of industry and corporations, the corporations are actually enshrined in the Constitution, which is a very unique portion. Pennsylvania politics tend to be, and you mentioned this, transactional. There's a lot about what can I get out of this? What are you giving me for that? What am I getting here? So a lot of it is about individual interests and protecting the rights of business as well as the rights of individuals. So Pennsylvania politics, it tends to have that tradition of independence, but also transaction. I have to tell a funny little story. My grandmother, I've lost her memory, she's passed away. She used to say, she was Schuylkill County, she's like, it's not like the old days when they used to pay you for your vote. I think that's great, because they would go and they would round up all the factory ladies and they'd give them a beer and a sandwich and like a couple of bucks if they would show up to vote. That was part of the political culture, I guess. I'll vote if you give me something.
But that's a tradition that goes back to Washington's time. They used to call it treating the voters. You get all your party's people together, get them all drunk, lots of beer, ale, and food. They'd sleep off. This is the night before the election. They'd sleep it off, get them up the next morning, load them on a wagon, take them to the polling place. And voting back then was public. People would, in an open air, just raise your hand who you want to vote for. Paper ballots would come in later. And even those were public because the parties had different colors. So you grab your party's color, everyone would see it, right? But that treating the voter is a long tradition nationally. And in Pennsylvania, yeah, we have a tradition of transactional politics. In that chapter on political culture, political geography, we draw on the work of Daniel Elazar, political scientist at Temple University. And he wrote a book, American Federalism, A View from the States, in which he described he was the first to really do this systematically. He described three political cultures that he could identify across the 50 states. And the one culture that dominates Pennsylvania is the individualistic political culture. And an individualistic political culture is transactional. So I get involved in politics because I can get something out of it. And so if I run for office, it's because I hope to improve myself and maybe my community will benefit as well. And in that kind of a political culture, there's the opportunity for some shady business because, let's just say, questionable and sometimes illegal transactions occur, and the general public will shrug their shoulders and say, that's the price of doing business. There are so many other features of this which we describe in that chapter that Elazar described. Anyway, if the individualism is the individualistic political culture is the dominant, the other two that he described were moralistic and traditional. And a moralistic one you would find mostly in New England, but there are parts of the state where a moralistic political culture places a higher value on ethics and in community value. In other words, it's not you don't get involved in politics for what you as an individual would get out of it. It's what will the community benefit. And so it's a much more, in some ways, idealistic approach. And the other traditional is what one would find in the Old South, the Confederate South, which is certain people are identified as those who are appropriate to govern. And the tradition has it that those people get to govern and where the rest of us just sit back and let them do their thing. Okay? And one would find that in the southern tier part of Pennsylvania because of the closeness to the Mason-Dixon line, okay, where slaves were held, and a traditional political culture was generally found in slaveholding, where slavery was a dominant part of the culture.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books Podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Now, you also talk about Colin Woodard and his ideas.
Oh, yes.
Where the Midlands, New Yankeedom, and Greater Appalachia, what are the differences between those?
Yeah. One could say that he put new labels on old bottles, and many more bottles instead of 3. I added that because it just gave another way of demonstrating how one could identify political culture. Okay? And I would say that what Woodard described really overlapped a good deal with Eleazar, who is better known, and Woodard's categories that we find in Pennsylvania really are individualistic political culture, with a slightly different set of, not a different, completely different, but slightly different criteria for what defines it as idealistic or any of the other things that Woodard described.
Now, in the progressive era, a lot of institutional changes were made to make direct democracy a little bit more a part of a political culture, and things like initiative, referendum, recall. But Pennsylvania doesn't really have those. So how did Pennsylvania miss that era?
Probably because of the party machines. We were very much a machine-driven, controlling the large cities, that whole party mechanism. So, yeah, I mentioned that it's power to the people, but we don't want too much power to the people. So it's a balance between the elites, who are not elite as in the Southern sense, but elites in the political elite, the party bosses, and who control the elected officials, who then control the voters. Yeah, we don't want Pennsylvanians removing their governor because they, as in California, because they don't like him, or I can't say her, him. You get one shot. You get one shot every 4 years, and that's it. And then you're stuck with that individual. We do have referendum and initiative limited mainly at the local level. Yeah, mainly at the local level. You'll hear that in regard to like your school district. So I live in Hazleton Area School District. There's discussion about if they want to build a school, and if they want to go over a certain limit, they're going to have to take that to us, the voters. So it is there, but it's at the local level, not at the statewide.
The parties, it's all about the parties. We do have a very traditional two-party system, and the parties, during the progressive era, it didn't really sweep through Pennsylvania in the way it swept through many of the other states, especially when you get west of the Mississippi. Our most famous progressive governor, Pinchot, brought in environmentalism. Right? That was as far as we got with progressivism here, really. Okay? And you will never see, well, we have never yet seen recall. Paula mentioned that initiative and more referendum than initiative.
Yeah,
but
initiative.
Referendum will be found in various local government functions. But having served on a government study commission for Luzerne County, we learned that we could institute initiative and referendum at the county level if we wanted, but never recall, because that's expressly forbidden in our state constitution.
You mentioned political machines. People probably know Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed, but in Pennsylvania, what are some of the key political machines that would have been around?
Well, you said they're party-driven, the Republicans and the Democrats, but it was also starting at the local level. So you're from Philadelphia, so you can speak more to Philadelphia. That was
Happy
very
to.
powerful by the ward. So it's top down and bottom up. So the party at the top would, in theory, you go to a convention, you're elected as a delegate and you go to the convention and you pick these people, but in reality, there were party bosses that were in control. And the way they kept control, and this goes to my late father's era, so from the 40s to the 70s, maybe even the 80s, was by the handing out of jobs. So patronage greased the wheels of the machines. And so it could be at It could be in City Hall in Philadelphia, it could be working on a road crew for Luzerne County, or it could be having a state-level job. Everything was given out based on party loyalty. So patronage was huge. We've reformed back a little from that, but Pennsylvania still has a large number of patronage jobs that are available when there's a change in party. So I would say jobs was the main mechanism to keep people loyal.
Yeah. So Pennsylvania's politics was dominated by the Republican Party from the Civil War forward. And there were state party bosses like Cameron, Penrose, who, as Paula said, were adept at distributing patronage. Not just jobs, but contracts. You need roads built. If your company gives to the state, you'll get the contract. And as Paula also said, there's the state party, but then there are county parties. And probably it's not as well known as the Tammany machine, but the Vare brothers in Philadelphia was the dominant Republican machine in the city. And nothing happened in that city unless the Vare brothers approved it. And the Vare brothers controlled City Hall. Okay? They basically picked the mayor, and then the mayor would run, but there's a foregone conclusion. And so in the city, if you wanted a job, you had to be a registered Republican. You had to demonstrate that you did vote Republican, and that's just
You had to contribute.
Or you were tithed.
Contributions were voluntary, but then they came with you had to buy the dinner, or it was all accepted.
Yeah, and if you worked for the city, you were expected to. It was I said tithing, but you were expected to give a portion of your salary back to the party. Okay.
Well, let's talk more about parties in general. Today, of course, we have the Democratic and Republican parties, but it hasn't always been that way. Take us back and kind of look at some of the parties that we've had in the past that people may be surprised by, or that may be different from what we have today.
Well, you go all the way back. There were Pennsylvania's versions of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Federalists supported the U.S. Constitution of 1787. The Anti-Federalists, they opposed that Constitution. And Pennsylvania's versions of those parties were on the sides of, in Pennsylvania, the Anti-Federalists would have been supportive of the radical Constitution. Okay? Nationally, the Federalists disappeared after 1800, and they disappeared in the state as well. They were replaced by various parties of various names in the state, and things don't start to turn around again, or things start to change again with the election of Andrew Jackson nationally, a populist and a Democrat, a Jacksonian Democrat. And that party becomes one of the major parties nationally. And in Pennsylvania, that Democratic Party, the Jacksonian type Democratic Party, and I'm drawing a blank on the name here, but that came about in Pennsylvania. It was a Pennsylvania version of the Jacksonian Party. And it finally emerges as the Democratic Party we know today, prior to the election of 1860. And then since 1860, we've had Democrats and Republicans in the state. There have been third parties. There have been the Prohibition Party, the Farmers Alliance Party, Constitutional Party, the Socialist Party.
Socialist Party is particularly
the Libertarian Party. I don't want to leave anybody out now, but yeah, and again, because the two major parties dominate the state, the two parties automatically get their candidates on the ballot. Any other party, with the exception of the Libertarians and I think the Constitutionalists, have to get enough signatures for their candidates to get their names on the ballot. Okay, so basically 4 parties are guaranteed a place on the ballot if they decide to field a candidate. Any other party, for example, right now Robert Kennedy, who wants to get on the ballot in Pennsylvania, he has to gather a certain number of signatures on petitions to get on the presidential ballot in the state. There is no guarantee he will be on the ballot come the presidential election in November of 2024.
What's the relationship of the state party apparatus and the county parties?
Well, the state parties really control the county parties. So they distribute funds, and it kind of goes both ways. They distribute funds to the counties for countywide elections, but it also goes the opposite way, where at the county level they're raising money to assist the state, and then there's the relationship now more than ever with the national parties. So what used to be like, say, a governor's race, which might be funded more by the state parties, now or a congressional race, which would be funded by the state parties, is now seeing national money coming in from the outside. So a lot of the relationship is financial, but it's also, there's still a grassroots element, people knocking on your door, making now it's phone calls with the cell phones, reaching out text messages. So at the county level and even below at the local level is where they recruit poll workers, and we're at universities, they love to recruit students, so they get them involved at the very lowest level, and then some of them get to attend the county convention and then can become state delegates, and if they're lucky can even go to be delegates at the national convention. So it's both labor and money that is impacted.
So we interviewed lots of people for this book, and in interviewing leaders of the two parties at the state level, state party chairman, things have changed. Right? Yes. There was a time when the state parties had a fair amount of influence over the county parties, and below that, the district, whatever. But with the rise of, political scientists call it candidate-centered politics as opposed to party-centered politics, keeping control of individual members. For example, on the 117th, where some individual who decides he wants to challenge an incumbent member of the party in a primary, that makes it more difficult for the for the state level party to impose its will on the counties or on any individual who wants to run in a primary within the party. So the state party chairmen try to work with their state party committees to determine how to protect their members who are running for office. If there's an incumbent, they try to protect the incumbent. If there's an open seat, then should the party endorse someone for that seat? Now, this gets a lot of attention at the state level for statewide offices. So should the party endorse a candidate in a primary for, say, Auditor General or Treasurer or Attorney General? When the party decides to skip an endorsement, then it's a wide open contest, right? But to show you how weak parties have become, even when an endorsement is given, it doesn't guarantee that the party's endorsed candidate will win, right? So, and they also in these interviews, some of the chairman will have said that counties have a fair amount more, a bit more authority now than they once did, and that given the importance of mobilizing voters, that really happens at the bottom, right? Yeah. Because those people who are precinct captains or ward leaders, they know their constituents better than anyone else. They're also closest to the sources of distributing patronage, right? There aren't that. I mean, there are state level jobs that are patronage, but there are many more at the local level. Now, there have been those numbers of patronage jobs are slowly diminishing as the number of government jobs overall shrinks a bit. But as governments revert from state, let's say, mandated types of government. So most counties in Pennsylvania have a 3-commissioner form of government. Luzerne County has home rule. When it created home rule government, it consolidated the row offices, made them appointed instead of elected. When you had appointed people, when you had elected people running, say, the clerk of the courts, and you had patronage positions within that office, party faithful got the jobs. Contractors who worked for the county would find it beneficial to make contributions, and then they would get contracts. So, but there are only 7 counties in the state now that have home rule. So counties every now and then consider going home rule, and then most of them have declined, or the voters have rejected home rule. So we'll see. There's still some counties considering it right now.
I do want to talk about the judiciary a little bit. We do elect judges in Pennsylvania, and PCN, we always cover these judicial elections every other year. How long has Pennsylvania been electing judges?
Since the Constitution of 1876?
1876.
777, thank you. I'm not a historian. But yeah, and again, you could go back and look at how early on they were elected, then they were appointed, then they were elected. It went back and forth. But elected judges were in the Constitution in 77, and they've been consistently elected since then. Now, as you are well aware, there's always a debate over whether or not we should revert to appointment, or some kind of a merit appointment system, right? Pennsylvania for better courts.
The scholars have looked at this and over and over, and it doesn't favor one over the other in terms of avoiding corruption or better judgments.
Right. Yeah. There's no definitive answer as to which is the better method.
How you get the best judges. There's arguments pro and con for appointment. But then there's also an argument for the people having a say over the judicial system.
Yeah, pretty much every judge we interviewed said, "Oh, election is the way to go. You give the power to the people." But if we want to get into this, Pennsylvania's laws governing elections and contributions, funding elections, we have next to no regulations. So the largest contributors to judicial elections are lawyers. Right? And many of those lawyers end up practicing before the judges who they contributed to. The appearance of impropriety is there, possibly. It doesn't necessarily look good. But most voters don't pay attention to this. In fact, most voters don't really know who they're going to vote for when they go into the voting booth on election day for one of the off-year elections when judges are elected.
Judges are elected, unless it's something locally that's going on, as we know.
Or if there's a major
the kids for cash scandal. Well, then everybody, all of the judges were removed by the voters. So otherwise, people don't really, or if the retention vote. Okay, we'll keep them.
Most judges are retained.
I think because most people don't really interact with the judicial system that much, really. Unless you're brought up on criminal charges or you're going through a custody battle, we don't really, it's something that's happening out there. I know there's a lot of controversy about the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and is the Supreme Court biased in favor of the Democratic Party? But I think that's more political scientists and politicians arguing over that than people in the local coffee shop. They're not sitting around discussing the Pennsylvania Supreme Court.
Now, I do want to talk about, you talk about in the book about interest groups and different types of interest groups and how they attempt to influence public policy. Mm-hmm. And one of the things is model legislation. Now, if you follow the legislature and you see the bills that go through and you pay attention to what's going on in other states, you'll see similar bills popping up in different state legislatures. What is model legislation and who's writing those?
Lobbyists, and lobbying is not a dirty word, it is legal, as you know.
It's in the Bill of Rights.
Yes, and if you go to downtown Harrisburg, you of course have the Capitol, and then right around it you have all of those associations, right? Everything from coal and timber to
higher education.
Yeah, higher education to the beer and wine industry, and right, everyone's got their office, and a lot of those offices are staffed by former elected officials or former insiders who worked in previous administrations, and they are lobbyists. And so their job, and I have had many students that have gotten jobs, is to advocate for whatever industry or viewpoint that they're representing, like say the Pennsylvania State Education Association. Or I'm a member of APSCUF, which is the faculty union for the state system. We have a lobbyist down here, and his job, they have an office, and their job is to monitor what's going on, but also to research issues, provide information, provide expert testimony, and then also, if necessary, literally propose legislation. So they go to the legislature, here's how we think you could fix this. And so they give them that model that has been crafted by people who, they keep attorneys on staff, they keep researchers. It's not, everybody thinks lobbyists, it's not all about steak dinners and under the table money. It's more about the exchange of information more than anything. Information is power.
And one of the organizations that you mentioned as an example of this is the American Legislative Exchange Council.
Alex.
What is that organization, and how do they write model legislation?
That's a national organization funded by conservative money, and it has historically, and it's not been around that long, maybe 20 years or so, but it has a great track record in writing model legislation or an ideal bill on a particular issue that in this case, Alec would want to see passed in all 50 states. So they'll write a bill. Let's say it's on gun control or on education or whatever. They'll find a member who, in any state legislature, who is sympathetic to their cause. And they'll hand it to them and say, this is a bill you might want to consider introducing. Now, that member could easily go into the legislature, or the House or the Senate, and drop it in the hopper, and it's introduced. Okay? Whether or not that bill gets passed is a whole other story. Whether or not it gets passed in the exact form it was introduced, again, whole other story. But the fact that the bill gets introduced at all means that at some point, someone's going to read it, and the member who introduced it can go back to his constituents and to the groups that support it and say, I did this. Okay? I satisfied your needs as constituents by introducing a bill.
Another aspect of Pennsylvania's political culture are political journalists.
Yes.
And we're going through a period of seeing significant decline in newspapers in general, but
Yes.
political journalists at the Capitol covering state government. How does that affect Pennsylvania's political culture?
Oh, we're both fans of newspapers. Yeah, we both still get paper newspapers. There has been nationally and also in Pennsylvania a decline in the number of newspapers and also in the number of news sources where people can turn to get coverage of local news and state news. Right?
They used to have bureaus, like many
Yes.
more bureaus right here in Harrisburg. So
the
now
mezzanine of the Capitol.
You have to rely on somebody else's, right, they're not there, somebody else's report of what's going on. So we'll see in our local newspaper, it's coming out of one or two sources. Fortunately, some of that has been made up by the online presence of like Spotlight. So there
Capitol Wire.
there are things there are independent journalists that are not necessarily that are filling in that gap by providing free, or sometimes they ask you to make a donation, but basically free news items. I subscribe to two blogs that come in every day, one conservative and one that's liberal, so I can see both sides of the issue, and they tell you what bills are being debated that day and whose birthday it is and what the issues are, and that's replaced print. There's still a fair amount of radio and we were just discussing how in our area, our local public television station, WVIA, has actually expanded the number of reporters that it has covering news, I guess in response to a decline in newspaper coverage.
Yeah, Wilkes-Barre is the only city in the state right now that has two daily newspapers. Both have reduced the number of print issues it publishes a week, and both have reduced the size of their papers, and lots more of the material in the paper is AP sourced. Yes. Fewer of their own reporters are out there covering things, and it shows. I mean, we're getting somewhat less news.
I think what also it'll restrict is investigative journalism. Uncovering misuse of funds or scandals. A lot of those things are the result of news reporters asking the right questions. And, it does impact democracy because that's the role of the press, is to keep the politicians accountable, because the public can't vote if they don't know what's going on. So that's probably the biggest
The sad part is they can't. But
Well, they can, but they're not making an informed
The vote is an
decision.
ignorant vote. So, as we say in the book, journalists are the people who stand in for the average citizen in the Capitol or in the county courthouse and ask the questions that the public can't ask because they're not there, and hold accountable elected officials. And the fewer journalists that are out there, the less that government officials are held accountable.
Now, we only have a few minutes left, but I just wanted to touch on a couple other things. One are political action committees. We hear about PACs all the time, and you mentioned earlier about not a lot of limits on campaign finance.
Yeah.
So what are PACs?
Well, okay, under the, again, this started at the federal level. Actually, I shouldn't say that. I'm not exactly sure where they originally started, but regulating and calling out PACs started at the national level, and they are supposedly independent organizations or bodies that are allowed to raise money and spend money in political campaigns. Okay, and after the Supreme Court decision, first Buckley versus Vallejo, which basically equated political spending with free speech, which means you cannot limit how much a person or an individual or a group can spend advocating for a cause. Then we get later, of course, Citizens United. But these political action committees raise money and can spend in places and in races and for individual candidates that parties necessarily would be limited in how much they can spend and the like. And then in Pennsylvania, PACs are barely limited in how much they're very limited, no limits really on how much they can raise, but there are very few limits on what they can spend. Okay.
Now, we just have a couple of minutes left. Paula, what would you like people to take away from this book?
That Pennsylvania is historically important, but continues to be the Keystone State, both in terms of national politics, culture, industry. It's a great place to live, and so if you live here, I think it's important that you understand how your government works at all levels so that you can participate.
Well, we've been speaking with Paula Duda Holoviak and Thomas Baldino. They are the authors of Pennsylvania Government and Politics. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.